you expect water to come out of the tap when you turn the tap on. Though I think some days that doesn't happen. And I also think that in Perm and in Oxford, this is where we started. Holes in the ground, and then wells with wooden linings or stone linings, the sort of thing that you find if you are doing an excavation. But what I'm interested in is how we get from there to today. Okay. So, I collected sites in Oxford. I did field work and I got about 1,000 sites in my database. And as you will see, this is how many sites, and this is how old they are, which this is a BC, and you've got one BC existing site. We have a Roman period, which you don't have in Perm. The early medieval is up to 1000 AD. Then this goes up to the middle of the 16th century. And then in England there was a big change. And so we went into the post-medieval period, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And you can see most of my sites are from post-medieval period, from 1540 to 1900. And then I have a smaller number, which are 1900 to 1970, and some, well, we don't know what date they are. We can't tell. But altogether, it's about 1,000. Now, I was in the ice cave yesterday, and you have a lot of limestone. We have limestone all the way at the top of Oxfordshire. This is Oxfordshire, and Oxford itself is here. But I live here, which is about 25 kilometres from Oxford. But up here is limestone. Here we have clay, then we have sand and chalk. So there are 4 different geologies, and the geology is important for how much water there is and how easy it is to get water. Here, in the chalk, the water is about 100 metres below the ground, which is a long way down if you're digging a well. And here, this is probably difficult. Down here is what we call the water table, which you probably call water table as well. And so if you're putting a well, you put it into the water table, and then you get springs coming out, streams higher up. And on the top, where there is clay, you can get ponds. So that's where the water is coming from. Okay. And this one just tells you where my sites were. And as I'm sure you know, it's important that your sample is a good representative sample, that you have an even spread, and that's my attempt to get an even spread, which is not bad. Okay. So, as everywhere, lots of people got their water from natural sources, from springs, from ponds, from streams, and from rivers. And this is the River Thames, And most of the water in Oxfordshire and in London comes from the River Thames. It's a very important source of water in our part of England. Okay, so our Roman period. We have lots of wells from excavations. And we also have water tanks from the Roman period. And this one, this is from the town where I live. This is from Tame. This is something that we found about 5 years ago. A big site, a very important site. This one is from the south. It's a lead tank. And this is a villa. Romans built stone houses, and this is the bath house from the Roman villa. The Romans had baths. When the Romans went, baths disappeared. People didn't have hot baths anymore. In the medieval period, we have more things. This is Oxford Castle, which was a royal castle. It was an important castle, and it has a big chamber, a well chamber, a stone well chamber. And you go down steps into this stone chamber. That is surviving. This one at New College, this is one of the Oxford colleges, and the one at the top, which is a house. These are toilets. This is a 14th century toilet building at the college. And these towers with windows, when they were built, they were the toilets. And the hole went straight down into the moat, into the water at the bottom. Just a tube. And those were the toilets. Now, in England, we were Catholic, Roman Catholic, until 1540. And we had lots of monasteries, like you do. But our Catholic monasteries were destroyed in 1540. And we went from being Catholic to Protestant, and Protestants didn't have monasteries. But the monasteries had very good water systems. And this is a water pipe from the monastery. But when the monasteries were destroyed, in Oxfordshire, the water supply was destroyed as well. So that was all that remained from that monastery's water. Okay. I don't know whether you have a tradition in Russian of springs and wells which are sacred, which are holy wells, which are to saints, for saints, associated with saints. And they are also associated with healing. So you go there and you pray and you drink the water or you wash your face and you're healed. These are some of the few, because like the monasteries, these are associated with the Catholic Church and you weren't allowed to use them anymore, unless they were really good at healing. And these are all good for eyes. If you had bad eyes, the water would make your eyes better. What we don't know is, was it the water, or was it the fact that you were actually bothering to wash? Was it just that you were a cleaner? But some of these survive, as you can see, and in the 20th century we had a new tradition in England, what we call New Age people. They are spiritual crystals and all sorts of strange things. But they revived these wells. And that one at the top is a special one. Is there anyone who has read Alice in Wonderland? Knows of Lewis Carroll? Yes? You may, if you've read Alice in Wonderland, there is something called a treacle well. And that is Alice's treacle well. And treacle means that it's a healing well. The word corrupted. But that one is very famous, as I say, because it appears in the Alice in Wonderland books. Okay. As we come a bit more recent, people were building new systems. This is now 16th and 17th century, and this is a place where springs, the water was collected into one tank, and then it was supplied to points in the street where people could get water. And in Oxford, there was a particular example called the Carfax Conduit, which is this big tower here. And that supplied water to Oxford colleges and other buildings in Oxford. And the water for this came from here, from the other side of the River Thames. So the water went into here and then in a pipe into the centre of Oxford. And it was 18th century, this was moved because it was blocking traffic. So they moved it, and it's now very difficult to get a picture of it. It's in a park in Oxfordshire. And this one was they played tricks with water. They had fountains, and if you walked along, you would get sprayed with water when you weren't expecting it. And that's being excavated at the moment. Okay, more to date. So this is 18th century, and you see that these two are water towers where they stored water, and that is a well house, the top one. And these three, like most of the things from the 18th century, are associated with big houses and big estates, not ordinary people. This one is for ordinary people. It's used to have taps all the way around, and it was in the centre of the town, and people could go and take water from the taps. But it doesn't work anymore. Okay, so we have a system in England for protecting historic monuments, and there are different sorts of protection. Very important monuments we call scheduled monuments, and they are very, very much protected. Then the next level, not as protected but not as important, are listed buildings. And then we have different lists of buildings and monuments that people need to know about. And then we have this category, undesignated. These are things that nobody knows about, or nobody has recorded. Nobody had recorded these until I did. And as you can see, very few very important ones, more of the listed buildings, but the biggest category, most of the sites, have not been recorded before. So this is the first time that they've been recorded. And you'll also see, remember I talked about the geology? Well, most of the sites come from limestone. Clay is, you get rivers on clay, not much on sand, and the chalk, as I say, it's very, very deep, so it's difficult. So most of these have limestone geology. Okay, that's not important, but you can see I've put things together, different sorts of monuments. And we've got things that supply water, that give you water, and they're all in one group. Then we have ways of purifying water and treating water and delivering water. We have storage, as you come down, and then we have leisure, which I'll talk about a bit if we have time. Things to do with keeping clean and being healthy. Waste, getting rid of wastewater, and then things that don't fit anywhere else. Okay. Okay, so at the top we have a lot of water is used by big estates for making gardens and lakes, but they also use the lake to supply drinking water. So you have a lake that looks nice, but there will be a pump by the side of the lake which will use the water for drinking as well. And this is a strange word. We only use that in Oxfordshire. It's a special Oxfordshire word for places for getting water, but they're not used anymore. And it's a way of, they're close to rivers. It's this, where the springs are getting close to the river. They put in these things which we call tides. And the different technologies that are used, different ways of moving the water. I think this is something that you will be familiar with, the idea of having pumps in the street. This is the most common. This is an unusual one. It has a bucket chain. It picks up the water at the bottom, and there are buckets which go round and drop and deliver the water at the top. So the water comes in at the bottom, into the bucket at the bottom, and out of the bucket at the top. And that's a Roman one, or a model of a Roman one. But that's a 19th century one which works in the same way. This one is surprising. It's an Arab word. I thought they only had them in Arab countries. I thought they were an Arab technology. But that is from Oxford. That was in Oxford in the 19th century, by the river. And they were getting water out of the river in Oxford with that early technology. All these things were discovered by the Greeks very early. These are all discovered in BC, and we're still using them. The Archimedes screw, I'm not going to go into the technology in detail. We don't use it very much for water, for drinking these days, but we are still using it for making electricity, the Archimedes screw. And this is a way of going from one place down and underneath and up the other side, the inverse siphon. And you may remember I talked about the one in Oxford where it went from one side of the river to the other, and that's how it worked. Because if the water starts at a high level, it will push, the pressure will let it push the water around nearly as high on the other side, but not, you can see this is where it starts, it's where it finishes, and it finishes lower down than it started, but it does go down and up. And then we went on to water wheels, different sorts of water wheels. And the water is taken out of the river using the water wheel. And this one was supplying an estate. It supplied water for the whole of the estate from the mill. These were in Oxford, but they've been replaced with modern facilities. And this was at a brewery for making beer, but you need a lot of water to make beer, so the water wheel, they had a water wheel and they had a well for getting water for the beer. And that one is still there. This is my favourite technology, something called a hydraulic ram. I don't know whether any of you have ever come across a hydraulic ram, but it's very simple. If you have water moving, it goes in this box and there are valves, and as the water comes in, the pressure goes up, so the pressure goes up and the valve opens. Then it compresses the air, the pressure becomes equal and the valve closes. And then the air expands and pushes the water up to the top. And then when the pressure goes down, the water pushes the valve open and it keeps on opening and closing the valves automatically. There's no motor, no animals, no people, just the water. That does it all for itself. And it's a very efficient, very cheap, very simple technology. And there are hundreds of these in England, in country areas, in fields. This one was put in about 1872, and at the top is a reservoir, and the pump is at the bottom of the hill, the reservoir is at the top of the hill, and the village is in between. And the reservoir sent water to lots of taps like this around the village. Very simple, very efficient. And I say that there are lots of them. This is in a field. It's underground, in a brick chamber underground. And That's where the pump is. And that's that's a picture of a clean one. They get very rusty and look as if they are not working, but they are. And then, of course, we became more modern and we got steam engines for water. In towns, we have steam engines. We have steam engines. Different sorts of steam engine. Again, I'm not going to talk about the technology. This was the Oxford one. It's now a sports centre. And the reservoir and the ponds, the parts of the waterworks are now swimming pools for the leisure centre. So they've kept the building and they've kept the reservoirs and they've reused them, but the steam engine has gone. But it would be like this one here. This is the nearest steam engine that still exists, and it's just across into the next county. So that was where we went next. But only in the now when I say big town, we don't have any towns in Oxfordshire anything like the size of Perm. Oxford is the biggest, which is 60,000 people, which is very small compared with Perm. Okay, so in towns, they started building waterworks in the 18th and 19th century. In Chipping Norton, the first waterworks was in the basement of a pub. And then they had a better one in a farm, which went to a water tower. That's not the original water tower. So the towns are having their own waterworks built. This is another one. This one is still used, it's been modernised, but that one is still operating. And in the late 19th century, they started building houses in towns, they built houses with water in the houses. And that was new for most houses. But we had, the government brought in laws which made people build proper houses. And here's some more waterworks. This one again in Henley, that is still used. In Witney, this is 1906, they had a water tower, and this was pumping the water from the river up to this water tower. And they opened the new water tower, and the tank split. And you can see, this is where the water tank was, and it split, and they lost all the water. So they rebuilt the tower, and they rebuilt the tank, and what happened? The tank split. At the third attempt, they got it right, but it took them a long time. And that operated for 30 years. Then they had a new waterworks, and that is now flats. People live in that now. Expensive flats. Okay, so in town, in North Oxford, when these houses were built, they had bathrooms and toilets. Sometimes they didn't have toilets for the servants. Sometimes the family had a toilet indoors, but the servants had to use a hut in the garden. These are the sorts of houses that they were building for professors at Oxford in the 19th century. Professors, not lecturers. Okay. But if you were poor, this is what you've got in Oxford. This is one pump for 20 families. No drains. Very, very bad. And this is a plan of a public bath. People didn't have baths in their houses in Oxford, a lot of them. And that was built in 1962 in Oxford, so that people would be able to go and have a hot bath and do their washing. But they were only open for about 10 or 15 years, and then people had hot water into their houses. But that, I say, that's 1962 that they were still building public baths. Okay, so in the countryside it was different, and in some ways, but not in others. Now these are for the rural upper class. This is for people, well, Blenheim at the top. This is for the Duke of Marlborough. You may have heard of the Duke of Marlborough. The Churchill family, as in Winston Churchill, they were given Blenheim by Queen Anne because he won lots of battles, and he was given his big estate, and they built this palace. That's a bridge over the lake and the river, and it had a water wheel inside it, inside the bridge, which pumped water up into that tower in the house for the kitchens. So that was, they had quite a lot of water. They had a bath in the palace. This is the sort of thing, people had cold baths. We didn't go in for much. We didn't do much washing at the time in England, but people had a cold bath in the open air. And this is rich people. They had their baths outside. But this is another one. This house, this is the house, and they had tunnels, underground tunnels, bringing water from the springs in the fields. And the tunnels came through, and the house used water, and any spare water then went into the garden and into the farm buildings. It was a very elaborate list of series of tunnels, underground tunnels, and they're still there. These very long brick-lined tunnels. So it's quite sophisticated. However, that was the rich people. The poor people in the countryside, life was different. And this is where I think England is very different from Russia, because we had different sorts of land ownership. And I think you had your countryside, you had big landowners. We had a mixture. And we had villages which belonged to big landowners, which we called closed, and we had villages which didn't have one landowner. Different bits of land were owned by different people. They were owned by shopkeepers, small farmers, the church. Lots of people would own a few houses. And the two kinds of village were different. The ones with big landowners, there were not many houses. They controlled how many people could live there. They weren't allowed, there were very few shops, and quite often they weren't allowed to have public houses, to have an inn. And they had to go to the Protestant, the Church of England, the state church. That was all they had. In the other villages, there were lots more people. They had shops, they had pubs, they had people who were craftsmen. They didn't just work as farmers for the landowner. They had different sorts of religions, they had different sorts of politics. They were much freer. And when I was doing my research, I wanted to see whether the water supply was different between the two sorts of village. Whether these people were better at giving water to their inhabitants. And I think that is true. Okay, so that's Oxfordshire, and you can see the closed ones, the ones with one big landowner, the green ones, and you can see that there's a lot of green over here in the limestone because that's good farming land. Down here there's a lot of wood, so the woodland was different. And this is, again, it's not very good. Not very good for farming down there. So where you have good farming land, you have one landowner. Where you have woodland, or you have hills, or you have mining, we have iron mining, then you don't have one landowner. And the villages are a bit different. Right, so this is a specific sample of domestic water supply, where I knew what date, what kind of parish, and I knew that it was for a group of families. And that was my sample. Okay, so we get the ones with lots of landowners. It was messy. It was very different. This one, Blueberry, is interesting because every house virtually has its own well. But you can see that the water is only about half a metre down. So anybody can dig half a metre. Very easy to dig your own well if you're only digging half a metre. That would have been a well, but in the 20th century they put in a tap, and these taps are still there in the street. Why? I don't know, because they don't get used. However, in the big landowners, you've got more pumps. And this village had 17 wells and 3 pumps put in around the village by that landowner. This one again, that's the old well, but they have pumps like that, taps like that, all around the village. This is a very small village, and it has a well in the middle, and the cottages, row of cottages, also have a pump. And that's another small village, and again it's got a well and a pump. So there's much more in these, the villages with big landowners. There's much more, much easier for people to get drinking water. Give some more examples of things that people did. Those houses at the top there, they were built with rainwater tanks. So when the landowner built them, he put in rainwater collection tanks in the house so that people could have water stored in their houses. Pump, another pump in the village. This water tower was built, one man paid for that water tower for his village. And it's by the side of the motorway, and I thought it was for the motorway. I thought it was to do with the motorway, but it's not. It's one village. One man built that for his village. But even if you've got a pump, you still have to get the water from the pump in the centre of the village to your house. Who's going to do it? Mostly the women and the children. And I don't know how well you can see, but they have yokes over their shoulders with buckets. And there's women there as well, but there's some men as well. So I'll come talk about that one again if we have time. But you're pumping, it's hard work. Have any of you ever got water from a well or a pump? No?
Yes.
Well, yeah,
Yes.
you have. And it's hard, isn't it? And to do that every day for all your water, which is what these people do. Some of them paid people to get water for them. These are water collectors, and they take their horse and cart down to the river, fill up the barrel, come back, and then sell the water. And sometimes getting the water 5 kilometres from the village, bringing it 5 kilometres. And this is hard. 1930, I don't know what you think. 1930 is well before you were born, but in 1930 we were still building new houses in villages with no water to the houses. And these are all brand new houses from 1930s, and the houses go round and there's a pump in the middle, or in the case of Kidlington, there's one well. 1930 seems, well, to me, very recent. It was difficult to believe they were still not putting water in houses. And these are not little villages. This is not little places with 2 houses. These are big villages, small towns. Then we have special systems. This is a rainwater system for the village. It's a big tank, reservoir, open, and they collect the rainwater. And there was a man in a hut who would check that you weren't taking more water than you were allowed. You were given, there was a quota, and you were allowed 2 gallons per person per day, which is 2 gallons is 10 litres of water per person per day. Now, you probably don't realise that perhaps if you go to the toilet you'll use 20 litres just. I think possibly in Russia there you have smaller tanks, but it's a lot of water. Okay, this is another village where they have ponds. They had ponds, and there are 2 ponds. So they made 1 pond for the animals and 1 pond for the people. And one for the people, they put steps down to make it easier to get to the water. And then they put in, I think, it's a hydraulic ram pump to make it easier still. This is not typical. Okay. I was also interested who paid. Who was doing this and who was paying for it? Well, in the 19th century, there was a big problem in England with alcohol. And people were trying to get people to drink less alcohol. But they were drinking alcohol because the water wasn't clean. So they would well, alcohol was healthier in some ways. So there are things, the Drinking Fountain Association, and they went round putting in drinking fountains and troughs for the animals to make it easier for people not to use alcohol. And we have hotels which didn't serve alcohol, temperance hotels. So it was all ways of trying to persuade people to drink more water. And we also had people who built new houses for poor people. And they built big blocks. Now, in England, most people live in houses, individual houses, not in flats. But these people were building blocks of flats for the people. And this is the only one of two blocks that were built in Oxford. It's very unusual in Oxfordshire. And this was built by Christ Church College, which is one of the richest Oxford colleges. They built these flats. And they were good landowners. They put toilets and wash houses. They put in very good facilities. It was a wonderful example of what you can do. A lot of them also, there were rules. And if you were not a good tenant, if you didn't keep the rules, you lost your house. But Christchurch had a very good reputation. These are all things which are given by individual people. We paid to put in pumps. And these, all of these four, are in the chalk, and they're all about 100 metres down to the water. And you didn't get these wells very often until they could do mechanical digging, because if you go down that far, it's too dangerous to put a man and a shovel and a candle down the hole. Politicians everywhere do things to win votes, and these are all water fountains that were put in by politicians to impress the voters. Sometimes they were done as memorials, different families, or different individuals, but these are put in to remember families. I'll just talk about this bit for a moment. This one is a very deep well. It's known as the Maharaja's well, and it's unusual because it was paid for by the Maharaja of Benares in India, who paid for a well in Oxfordshire. And there's another one, I'm not sure. Right, and that was paid for, that's another one, just up the road, which was also paid for by one of that Indian, somebody from that Indian family. And in England, we went out to India to help them become civilized, but we are still relying on Indians to give us drinking water. It's a very strange example, but it's a very famous, that one is very famous. Okay. Skip over that. In fact, I think I will pause there. I've got more slides, but that's the bulk of it. So you can see that we have lots of different systems in Oxfordshire. We have different systems in England. And what what you can do when you look at them in detail is you can see how different people lived in different social classes, in different parts of the country. You can see the relationship between the geology and water supply. You can see the relationship between land ownership and water supply. And it tells you a lot about the social history of an area. Okay, if I stop there, are there any questions? Did any of that make sense?
Thank you. Вопросы, товарищи? Задавай. Никита, ты громче всех смеешься.
Нет, я слишком плохой английский для такого. Ничего страшного.
На руках объясни.
Нет, зачем это? А? What's about black diggers and their archaeological field?
Sorry?
Black diggers.
Black?
Black diggers. That's really off topic. Criminal archaeology. Destroy a bunch of bombs and other.
Until recently, nobody cared about things like this. So yes, they were destroyed because we all had taps. Why do you need to keep that? Some of them were turned into ornaments. Some of the drinking troughs are now flower beds. They put no water, just flowers. But no, nobody cared. The big waterworks in Banbury, with the steam engine, they just knocked it down one night. It was, nobody cared.
Еще вопросы? По теме желательно.
Okay. Do you know when a system for washing flowers was be more good?
Say it again.
Have a more level, more high level.
When it became, everybody got water effectively in the 1960s, 1960s, say 1970.
Okay, thank you.
How archaeological mark of water supply project in excavation?
In excavation, I mean, it's usually wells.
If you see the water.
Well, no, the lining. Usually, you can see the lining rather than the water. They're filled in.
Geological structure.
But geology, no, I mean, there are lots of springs still. We still have lots of, and there are ponds. You need to dig them and see what you get. It's not very easy to find.
Еще вопросы?
So, I mean,
Can I ask about the churches which were destroyed? So
yes.
nothing known about what mechanisms supported those churches. So what mechanisms brought water to?
Only from archaeological excavations. Bits of pipe. Sometimes you can see water channels where I mean they would have the infirmary normally had water going through, and you can find the water channels in the excavations. In other parts of England, there are lots more remaining, but in Oxfordshire, Yes, it varies because some monasteries shared their water with the town, and then when the monastery was destroyed, the town kept the water supply. But Oxford monasteries weren't like that. So this is very much Oxfordshire. What I'd like to do is do another place in another part of England and do a comparison. But and nobody else has done this level of research on an area, so I can't.
And what about other areas? There wasn't such research as well, right?
It just hasn't been researched in the same way. Yeah. I mean, it's strange because water is so important. Everybody must have water, but we take it for granted. We assume we have water.
Так, еще вопросы? Спасибо.
I'm just interested when you're doing all this job for your doctors. Because you said in the lecture that one of the places were found 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that was just after, because that's where I live. So that's why I know about that one. But no, I did it. I finished this. I finished this about 5 years ago. I did this part-time while I was working.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, was I right to assume that Perm has reservoirs and everybody has running water in Perm? In Perm City. I know we were talking about it earlier in the week, and I know that the villages, a lot of villages, are still have a pump or a well in parts of Russia.
In villages, it's local pump. Well.
I mean, putting in the pipes is very expensive.
From city, no.
And Russia is such a big area that the cost of putting pipes in is
No.
Да нет, просто воды много.
Material of pipes.
Well, they started with wood. The early ones were wood. Then some of the monasteries had lead. Then they eventually got to ceramic, clay, baked clay, and now, of course, everything is plastic.
Metal?
No. Metal rots, plastic doesn't. So new ones, all the new ones are plastic. In fact, yes, we have a problem with rotting metal.
Еще вопросы?
And when do the system which pures the water appears in industry?
Sorry?
So, nowadays we use special mechanism or some chemistry to pure the water.
Yes.
And when it appeared in history, so is it only 20th century? Or
No.
what was the earliest
The earliest,
case? Yes.
it's mainly 19th century. It is. But if you deliberately, but if you leave water in a tank,
Yes.
most things will settle anyway. So there is and sand, if you get sand in it, sand is very good. So they would have started using sand first. But I've not talked about waste, there's all sorts of things I haven't talked about, but I think that's probably enough.
Спасибо. Еще? Все? Еще?
Okay, and probably the richest people were the one who gave money to build any of this kind of mechanism.
Yes. Until the end of the 19th century, we had no government system.
Yes.
You were relying on
maybe except for
rich
the
people.
holes in the which were like half a meter.
Well, that was, I mean, they were just,
Yeah.
they have them in the kitchen in their house, because it's so easy.
Yes. Exactly that.
Yes. In fact, they still have them, that village, they still have the wells, and they are tested, and they can still use that water. And if they want to, they can still use. They don't unless there's a problem, but they are tested and they can still use them.
Что? Еще есть вопросы?
I'm sorry, but what was the longest piece of a pipe or something like this, or channel found in the area?
Channel, probably, one of the monasteries, probably nearly 100 metres.
I'm just interested in how far you can reach.
Oh, I mean, the water from the monastery would have been brought kilometres, but we don't have.
Yeah, we don't have it.
Yes, we don't have the evidence for that. We only have the short sections.
I have a question. В siphon construction in Roman time, is a Roman project of water supply.
In some places the Romans put in very complicated aqueducts and systems, not in Oxfordshire. There were not, I think just the biggest Roman site, there was a fort in Oxfordshire, but there's not, and there were pottery manufacture, but Oxfordshire was not a big Roman area. Not like in other parts of England, and Dorchester in Dorset, they still have the aqueduct that the Romans put in, but they never did anything in our area on that scale.
Так, еще?
Maybe I missed the information, but who designed that thing that opened the hole in it and then waterized and then it's closed?
The hydraulic ramp. I didn't say. It was actually they were actually invented by the Montgolfier brothers, who were French, and they were one of the people that started hot air balloons as well.
Oh, I see.
Yes. That was about 1790.
Еще? Все? Вопросов больше нет? Ну что ж, тогда...
Well, I hope it was interesting, and water is important. It will always be important, and I think we are going to have problems. I think we are going to run out of water, so we're going to have to think about maybe going back to some of this.
It's very interesting because Russian archaeology not many research about water supply, only Roman.
Exactly, the Roman and the Middle East. Yes, yes.
In another part, I not this research.
No,
It's very interesting.
Can I ask just one last question?
Well, you're controlling the timing of this exercise,
Yeah,
so.
I'm just looking into it. It seems to me that for a very long time in history, people used the same pipes or the same system, for example, up to the destroyment of churches. The system runs in one way.
Yes.
Then when churches were destroyed, another system had to be installed.
Well, I think-
something should be done. And what was the changes?
Well, the change was the whole society changed,
Yes.
because we went from having big landowners and peasants
Yes.
to having big landowners, middle-class merchants, and the peasants were better paid, they had more freedom. So people started thinking differently. So the combination, it happened at about the same time.
I was interested in the periodics, not by the Middle Ages, something, but we provided water like this for some time, then we changed for that kind of method.
Well, no, it wasn't a. It wouldn't have been a. Yes. It changed at slightly different times in different places, in different ways. Yes, it's not a. Because there was no central regulation.
Yes.
Yes, I mean even in the 20th century there was a plan. Houses should have this, this and this, but they didn't have the money, so they didn't build them according to the plan.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Если вопросов больше нет, so thank you.
Thank you.
Ну что, товарищи студенты, мы выяснили, кто у нас лучше всех слушает лекцию. Это была